All right, well, good morning. Happy Monday. Welcome back to Breakfast with the Bible. And if this is your first time, well, not welcome back, just welcome. So, if you've paid attention to where we're at, we're still in Psalm 44, and we intend to cover 15. And I figured with only 15 to 22 and then 23 to 26, we'll go ahead and do all of them together. So, we know already that the first passage, the first section of this psalm, the psalmist was talking about how they remember their fathers telling them stories about what God had done. God had delivered them. God had provided for them. God had done miraculous things for them. So the psalmist was recalling all of these stories, the legacy that God had done for their fathers and even before that. So there's this expectation by the psalmist and those people around him for God to do something relatively familiar to them, something that they can almost relate to what their fathers had told them, what their elders and the older generation had shared with them. So when they get to this point where they're in trouble, they have this expectation for God to do something similar to what he had done in the past for their fathers and so on. But then we go through verse from 9 to 14, and the psalmist is surprised almost that what they're experiencing does not necessarily line up with everything that they had heard. So they got to this, they were confident that they were going to see this movement of God on their behalf at this point, and it appears that they didn't see that, so they were kind of surprised. They were shocked. We didn't see the results that we had anticipated based on the stories we'd been told by our forefathers. So then in verse 15, we start this. The psalmist has another transition from verse 14 to 15. In verse 14, he says, "Thou makest us a byword among the heathen, a shaking of the head among the people." So he's still explaining how they're looked at, how they're looked upon by the people around them. Those who say, "You trusted in God, and now look, he's not doing anything for you." And the psalmist could almost kind of see where these people are coming from. I kind of understand that. You kind of have a point. He's not doing what we expected him to do right now. We expected to see this deliverance, this miraculous work of God to be done on our behalf, and it hasn't happened yet. So we're kind of at a loss for words. We're not really sure how to navigate this because we had anticipated this particular kind of action, and we don't see it. Now we feel cast off. We feel put to shame. We feel like we have to run from the enemy because we can't stand on our own. So verse 15, and I'll go ahead and read all the way to 26. My confusion, this word confusion in King James is really dishonor. My dishonor is continually before me. So now, why would this psalmist feel this dishonor if he doesn't understand why they're experiencing this kind of thing, why God's not doing what they expected him to do? My dishonor is continually before me, and the shame of my face hath covered me. So now he feels there's a sense of shame. For the voice of him that reproacheth and blasphemeth by reason of the enemy and avenger, all this is come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant. There's this plea, this rebuttal. Hey, we feel like we're cast off by God, but we've done everything we're supposed to do. Verse 18, our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons. This word dragons is jackals. I still have my debates on that, but it's irrelevant. And covered us with the shadow of death. They feel like they're going to die. If we have forgotten the name of our God, or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. Yea, for thy sake are we killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Awake, why sleepest thou? O Lord, arise, cast us not off forever. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and forgettest our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our belly cleaveth unto the earth. Arise for our help, and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. Now, that for thy mercy's sake, I love when an author or a writer in Scripture makes that kind of statement, for thy sake, for thy name's sake, because really it is all for the sake of Christ, for the sake of God. Arise for our help and redeem us, not for our sakes, for thy mercy's sake, because it lines up with the character of God. So we saw that the psalmist's reaction to something he wasn't sure he understood. My confusion, my dishonor is continually before me. Contrasting what was expected in verses 1 to 8, this retrospective of stories that they were told about how God had shown up and God had done mighty things, with the contrast with what had actually happened, verses 9 to 14. We felt cast off. We feel like God isn't doing what we thought he would do. But something happened between 14 and 15, like we spoke about. This transition again with the psalmist saying, he's talking about the way people are talking about him and how kind of making fun of him because he believed God and he doesn't see this, what he expected to see. But something changes when he hits verse 15, and he's talking about his dishonor and his shame. Now, it's not a shame because of what the people are saying. So Spurgeon wrote, the poet makes himself the representative of his nation and declares his own constant distress of soul. One constant blush, like a crimson mantle, covered him both before God and man. He felt before God that the divine desertion was well deserved, and before man that he and his people were despicable indeed, now that heavenly help was gone. It is well for a nation when there still exist in it men who lay to heart its sin and shame. How many of us would stand boldly at the throne of God on behalf of a nation? It makes me want to ask, while I am certain many are praying for God to fix our nation because we feel in need, I wonder how many are going to God on behalf of the sins of our nation. Remember Jeremiah. Jeremiah stood on behalf of the sins and lamented for the sins of the nation. Something to think about, really. And how many of us would say that we have or even are willing to go to God and say, we have sinned, and include yourself in that prayer. Now, it's not to say that we have done the same despicable things, but we have sinned. We're still sinners as believers. We still sin. We can go to God and say, on behalf of the church of God, on behalf of Christ's church, save our nation. We have sinned against you, Lord. And come to our aid and help in any way that we can really get you to help. Looking at verse 16, for the voice of him that reproacheth and blasphemeth by reason of the enemy and avenger. It gives us this natural progression of the wicked. Going from mocking the people of God to reviling God himself. For the voice of him that reproaches and blasphemes by reason of the enemy and avenger. It goes from making fun of God's people to mocking God to his face. And you've seen it a lot lately. It's happening more and more, I think, or at least it's being promoted more and more. It's being shown more and more. We see this in entertainment. We see this in media. We see it politics, we see it everywhere, where God is not only avoided, but he is mocked. And it's going to be, again, it's that natural progression for the wicked. And then we look at verse 17. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant. In a boldness, the psalmist confronts God with acknowledgement of how he felt, yet a firm remembrance of God's covenant. Okay, implying that God had obligated himself by his covenant to do something for his people. In the Old Testament, the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, promised that if Israel was obedient, God would bless them. That's a little bit different than the New Testament covenant, but for the sake of the Old Testament, God said, if you are obedient, I will bless you. And the psalmist is saying, hey, we've done what we're supposed to do. We have not dealt falsely in thy covenant. We have not forgotten thee. The statement, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant, indicates that the psalmist expects God to hold up his end of the covenant. Okay, this was not a prideful boasting. This was confidence. The psalmist knew he could approach God in such a way. We have not forgotten thee. We have not dealt falsely. We have done what you've asked us to do. We have walked according to your ways. Verse 18, our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. So we've followed your instruction. We've not turned from it. We've consistently pressed forward according to your word. Excuse me. Continuing his case, the psalmist reminds God that they have maintained their obedience. Verse 19, though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons and covered us with the shadows of death. Makes me think of that verse in Job where it says, though you slay me, yet I will trust you. It's that song from Shane and Shane. Though you slay me, I will continue to worship. Doesn't matter what you do to me. I will continue to praise you. I will continue to serve you. I will continue to be obedient to you. Because we understand that suffering is part of the growth process as a believer. So though thou hast sore broken us, even though you have made us feel like we're cast off in the place of dragons and covered us with the shadow of death, even though, if we have forgotten the name of our God or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? This is the psalmist's declaration that he understands that nothing is hid from God. If we disobeyed, if we had dealt falsely, if we had turned our back, if we had stepped outside of obedience, by all means, treat us accordingly. This is what the psalmist is saying. Does not God know everything we do? Does he not know the hearts of man? And the psalmist is confident. Lord, if we have done these things, if we had turned away, if we had disobeyed your covenant, then you have every right to treat us this way. But the psalmist says, we haven't done that. We haven't turned away from you. We haven't disobeyed you in such a way. Now, it is a seriously confident person, seriously confident believer that goes to the Lord and says, you know that I have not done this. Now, I don't think there would be a boldness that would be required to make such a statement. Even if it were true, that concept is kind of an intimidating one. How many of us could comfortably go to God and say, hey, I don't know why you're doing this, but And again, Old Testament, I don't deserve this. We've done what you've asked us to do. Now, this isn't a prideful boasting. This isn't, give me what I've earned. This isn't like that. But the psalmist understands God's covenant. The psalmist understands that God had promised a certain kind of behavior, if you will. He's not saying God is acting unjustly. He's not saying anything against God. He's not saying that God doesn't have every right to do whatever he chooses. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion, and so on. I will raise vessels up for honor, and I will raise vessels up for dishonor. Who's gonna challenge God, or at least effectively? Okay, but the psalmist knows God's covenant, and he knows that God knows his covenant. So this isn't an argument. This isn't, hey, give me what I deserve, give me what I earn. But an underlying theme here at that point is in fact that, but it's not out of a proud spirit. It's definitely a humble one, understanding your position, being subjected to the Lord in it, saying, hey, if we've done these things, then we deserve everything you give us. But I believe what the psalmist is saying. I believe that we have not done that. I believe that we have been faithful in your word. So we were surprised when we didn't see the deliverance that we were expecting. So the psalmist is really kind of petitioning God to say, hey, I think we should maybe revisit this things a little bit. Maybe it's time for you to do something. Again, this isn't an anger, negative kind of approach to God. This is an honest, confident, bold approach. The psalmist would expect punishment and discipline if, in fact, they were worshiping strange gods or foreign gods. We haven't done that. We haven't made ourselves idols. We haven't looked away from you. Verse 22, yea, for thy sake are we killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. As each close to the sections of this psalm, here is a remarkable statement. This statement implies almost a strong willingness to endure the hardships. For the sake of the Lord, they endure. Now, Paul quotes this in Romans 8, 28 to 39. If you heard that, someone was driving extremely too fast. Romans 8, 28 to 39. Here we go. Which is where Paul is quoting this part. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. What shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Who is he that condemned? It is Christ that died, yea, rather, that is raised again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, quoting this psalm, for thy sake we are killed all the day long, we are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. It is this idea that we willingly sacrifice ourselves. Again, Paul says, offer yourselves a living sacrifice. We do it willingly. Lord, not only have we obeyed you, not only have we not turned away, we've not worshiped strange gods, we have effectively offered ourselves with a willingness to die for you. This is a bold statement. A lot of us would say, yes, I would like to be able to say that. I would like to believe that if it came down to it, I would die for my faith. But do you know for sure? I think that's a very, very difficult question to answer, because most of us have not, and Lord willing, will not have to make that decision. I think that we may be closer than we used to be, but that's all speculation. This idea lies at the heart of the psalmist's plea. Verse 23, awake, why sleepest thou? O Lord, arise, cast us not off forever. The psalmist here, like we've seen before, but David feels as if God is asleep. One with a familiarity with the presence of God would feel free to address God regarding these feelings. Commentator Clark wrote, this is a freedom of speech which can only be allowed to inspired men, and in their mouths it is always to be figuratively understood. Meaning, God doesn't sleep. He doesn't slumber. Okay, consider Matthew 8, 23 and 26, which I'll go real quick. Matthew 8, 23 to 26. Again, with these thin pages. 23 to 26. And when he was entered into a ship, his disciples followed him. This is Jesus. And behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. And his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we perish. And he saith unto them, why are you fearful, O ye of little faith? It's a good example that while Christ was asleep, indeed, Christ was still in the boat. The presence of God was still there. God himself never sleeps, never slumbers. Christ, as a man, required rest. But the presence of God was there. The author of Psalm 121 wrote in verse 4, behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. So again, this psalm, this verse, awake, is figurative. God does not take a nap. He's not sleeping on the job. Verse 24, wherefore hidest thou thy face? Why are you hiding your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? The psalmist feels as though the Lord has turned away, allowing them to be defeated. And since we know that God either causes things, ordains things, or allows things to happen, allowing these people to be defeated was his intention all along. Now, had they deserved it, either way it doesn't matter, because God knows the end from the beginning. So it was still intertwined with his plan to begin with. Verse 25, for our soul is bowed down to the dust, our belly cleaveth unto the earth. Our soul, our body, this sense of God being asleep or turning away affects them totally. Our soul is bowed down to the dust, and our belly cleaveth unto the earth. So the psalmist is saying, the fact that I feel like God is distant, God is asleep, affects me completely. The thought of feeling or being out of the presence of God, or at the very least out of fellowship, should be to us an immensely heavy burden. We should feel dramatically affected by the sense of a loss of presence of God. Great effort must be made with seeking and prayer in order to alleviate it. So if you feel distant from God, guess who moved? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't God. So we need to feel this emptiness when that presence is missing, when we fail to spend time in prayer, when we neglect our time in the Word, when we feel like something's missing, the presence of God just isn't as powerful as it has been. We can generally tie it back to how much time we spend in prayer or spend in God's Word. Verse 26, arise for our help and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. It is rare that we've seen a psalm end without some kind of shift in attitude. This psalm ends still with a plea for help, a cry for redemption, and perfectly motivated by the desire for God's glorification. Arise for our help and redeem us. We still need you to show up, but do it for your mercy's sake. Do it for the sake of your name, because this is what you've promised to do. That should be our motivation as well. We seek answers to prayer for various reasons, but at the very top of each should be the desire to see God's name be glorified. In everything you do, seek God's glorification. Seek his recognition. Don't answer my prayer for my sake. Answer my prayer for your name's sake. If it's not a prayer that's going to glorify God, then ignore it. I'll pray it, and I'll even put an effort in it. But Lord, if you see if the answer to that prayer is not going to glorify you, I don't want you to answer it. This is the motivation we should have. So that closes up Psalm 44. I pray you were challenged by it, like I always do. Pray that you were blessed by it again. And tomorrow we will begin Psalm 45. Remember, do that thing you do with the thumbs up or the thumbs down or the comment or all that good stuff that goes along with it. Swing over to Twitter and do whatever you do there. And we will catch you next time. Thank you and God bless.